Hey guys, welcome back to World of Warships. Today we're taking a look at the Clausewitz, as I was having a tough time getting potential damage in cruisers. So I decided to play one of the tankiest cruisers in the game. This ship is so difficult to take down. We're actually going to get over 5 million potential damage in this one. And a lot of it comes down to this ship in general, but there are some things you can do to play around battleship salvos and attempt to dodge them. It's not always going to work. There's a lot of RNG involved with battleship salvos. I'm often the one complaining about battleship dispersion when it comes to shooting at enemy targets, but in the case of dodging battleship salvos, sometimes that can be a little bit unfortunate, where you dodge most of the salvo and then that one stray shell comes and hits you for half your health, right? Doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. So to deal with that, you definitely want to take advantage of certain game mechanics or limitations of this game. Namely that the aiming system is trying to assist you at all times. So we can take advantage of that to almost guaranteed force battleships to miss us. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. For now, we need to deal with these enemy destroyers. Clausewitz, being very tanky, allows me to play relatively confidently and push up to try and impact this engagement. We don't have a radar or anything like that. Clausewitz is getting its impact by dealing damage and hopefully taking some damage away from teammates, right? We want to be generally getting shot at a little bit in this ship, because that means our teammates aren't going to get shot at quite as much. Unfortunately, I think our Sherman took a torp there. Sherman's a bit of a brick, doesn't really maneuver all that well, so that's a little bit too bad to start, but still not too bad. We do help a little bit on the CCAP, and our team should get that eventually. I really wanted to push up, though, to get the broadside on this Des Moines. Clausewitz, being the super Hindenburg here, doesn't get a lot of advantages over Hindenburg. In fact, in some ways, the DPM is basically the same as Hindenburg, so not a lot there. So we don't actually get any sort of improved pen angles or anything like that. The AP is a little bit weak on this ship, let's say. I'll show you that in a little bit later, but I do not trust the AP on this ship at all. So you're going to see a lot of HE spam out of this ship, I think. And just angled enough that Des Moines to bounce our shells there. When we do get AP pens, and especially Citadels, there is some good alpha damage here. That's kind of the gimmick of the Hindenburg, the German cruiser line here, is that the AP alpha is quite good. Unfortunately, the shells are just very weak, where they don't have a lot of pen, and they tend to shatter a lot. And the dispersion, well, that one looks pretty good. We only get one Citadel there, unfortunately, but it's still a nice chunk of damage. So the AP is worth shooting some of the time. But between dispersion and the general lack of pen on these shells, it can be just easier to shoot the HE, because we do pen over 50 millimeters of armor. It's a big deal here at tier 10 and super ships, as that allows you to almost always full pen anything you're shooting at. It's very, very good. And our alpha damage here, if we land a lot of shells, well, that's over 5, nearly 6,000 damage out of that salvo of HE, and there's no angling to that HE. So we do manage to take this Des Moines out and continue to push this flank, although we have to be a little bit careful. I talk about this a lot, where anytime you're looking to push in, wait at the enemy spawn. Do not go into the enemy spawn, guys, please. It is almost always a bad idea. There's not a lot of things in this game where there's a hard and fast rule where it's always a good idea to do something or always a bad idea to do something. That's something that makes World of Warships very interesting, as there's always different decisions to be made. Every situation is different. Even though you're playing on the same maps with some of the same ships, every game is different. But generally, I'm going to say 99% of the time, it's wrong to push the enemy spawn. Generally, it means you are putting yourself at a massive disadvantage. Anytime you're pushing, you're always going to be at a disadvantage to someone kiting, because they have the ability to shoot at you with shorter flight times, right? Whenever you're pushing towards them, you just have to aim further than they have to, so it's a little harder. But generally also, whenever you push an enemy spawn, the team tends to come back and turtle up, and anybody on, let's say, the A flank in this case, comes back to try and deal with you, because you become a very easy target to focus on. So that's why we're going to stay here near this island and ideally not push in too much further. Notice the Republic coming back here. The Ohio's going to turn and look at us soon here as well. Montana, Wujing. There's a lot of battleships here alongside 2 enemy destroyers. So we do not want to be pushing this. But I do want to apply a little bit of pressure, right? We don't want to go completely dark. We don't want to give up entirely. That way the enemy team can focus on my somewhat lacking A flank here. So we do need to provide somewhat of a distraction without going too far in and getting ourselves killed for free. Our Unicum has pushed a little bit too far at this point, I would say, but he's doing okay as long as he doesn't fully commit around that island. Now, I'm angled completely into the Republic. If you didn't know, Clausewitz actually has very good deck armor. It's 51 millimeters. We'll look at it in port, but ideally, we're angled enough that we're bouncing a lot of battleship shells with this ship. That is the upgrade over the Hindenburg. You get better armor, and it allows you to stand up to battleships again. It feels a little bit like old Hindenburg. When Hindenburg was first released into this game, it had 30 millimeters of armor, which back then was a big deal. Zhao was the only thing with 30 millimeters of armor for cruisers, outside of a few premiums with better deck armor like Atago. But tech tree-wise, nothing had 30 mil armor but Zhao. And then Hindenburg released with more 30 mil armor, and it was even tankier than Zhao because it had better turret angles, and it allowed you to stand up to most of the battleships in the game, because at that time, only Yamato was released that actually could overmatch 30 millimeters of armor. Everything else had 406s, so there was a lot of overmatch back in the day, but that's simply because everybody had less than 30 millimeters of armor, so the 406s would overmatch everything. So Hindenburg felt like a bit of a battleship. There's probably a ton of videos that you guys remember watching about Battleship Hindenburg back in the day, and it does not play like that anymore. We have so much 30 millimeter overmatch these days. So Clausewitz gets that advantage. That's kind of the super gimmick of this ship. Not as extreme as something like the Condi or Annapolis, but it makes this ship very fun to play because it reminds me of old Hindenburg. Now, the AP here is going to be a little bit difficult to use as the dispersion is going to troll us, and I typically would just recommend spamming the high explosive. Back in the day, it was supposed to be more of an AP-focused ship. It did not have that 50 millimeters of pen on Hindenburg when it released, so you had low HE alpha and same HE pen, so typically you just wanted to run the AP. But here, we're just going to shatter and bounce and hit almost no shells on this broadside Montana. I'm trying to aim for upper belt here. He's just reversing in front of us. These should be easy shots, but look at this dispersion. It's pretty bad. I guess with the HE, if we're not hitting any shells either, it's not really going to be all that impressive. So maybe it's not armor piercing's fault. Maybe it's just dispersion, but a little bit unfortunate. We have lost our Colombo and our Unicum here, so we're in a bit of trouble. And you can see how the enemy team instantly turned to focus on our side of the map as we pushed in here. This is kind of the idea here behind not wanting to push into enemy spawn. It's a difficult thing to understand when to push and when not to push. Oftentimes, it's the best thing to do is once you've won your flank, you generally know it because the enemy team kites away from you. And once they're 15, maybe 18 kilometers away from the cap on your flank, the best idea for you to do is actually disengage from those kiting players and actually move back towards the middle of the map. And that way you can impact the game as it develops towards the middle of the map and the other side of the map. If a team gives up on one flank of the map, they're going to have to win the other side. And if you continue to push in behind them, well, you're not going to get the best results. Whereas if you can cross the map with them and re-flank with them as they're pushing over to the other side, you push back and reinforce that side they're about to be pushing on is kind of the idea here. So pretty lackluster damage here. Try not to focus on it too much, but yeah, I wish I could have done more to these battleships as they were pushing towards us, especially when they were broadside with that armor piercing. But we're going to get some better damage now. Maybe it was just lock-on bug, because look at that dispersion. Just looks totally different. There are plenty of bugs in this game, and that brings me to one of the biggest issues with aiming as a battleship. When a cruiser slows down and turns out, what happens is the auto aim system, the aim assist that's built into this game, and there's no way to turn it off, it actually pulls your shells short. The game has a very primitive version of auto aim where it only takes into account the speed and direction the ship is going in at the moment you fire your battleship guns. So if you shoot your battleship guns and then that cruiser decides to slow down and turn out, well, it's going to pull your shells towards where they would be going if they didn't slow down and they didn't turn out. And that's why the shells seem to go short, right? Because they pull the shells towards where that ship would be if it didn't maneuver. And that's why slowing down and turning out, or at least turning out, is so effective. It's this auto aim, this aim assist that pulls the shells away from where you would aim even. You might be expecting it. You probably do if you've played this game long enough. Cruisers always slow down and turn out. It's so effective. And it's because of this auto aim. And you can compensate for it, you can try to, but you'll notice that the X or the circle on the minimap is always going to be a little bit lower than you aim. And when you fire, it's always going to pull those shells short. So unfortunately, that's just a very hard limitation in this game, that it decides to pull your shells away from where you would be aiming if you're a good player. If you're new to the game, this auto aim helps you a lot because it pulls your shells generally in the vicinity of the enemy ship. But as you get better at the game, it becomes a hindrance and you can't actually get away from it. So as a cruiser player, we want to take advantage of that, and that's what I'm doing in this game. You can see me constantly varying my speed, and when I see shells coming in, I'm always trying to turn away from them. This also works to turn in if you're pushing, but generally we're kiting, right? When we're kiting away, when we're pushing away from the enemy team, then we want to turn away. If we're pushing into the enemy team, then we want to turn in, because then that's going to pull the shells too high. That's kind of how it goes. And as a battleship player, it sucks. Very frustrating. But as a cruiser player, trying to get this potential damage mission done, well, having 4 million potential damage already feels pretty good. Even a slight slowdown like that, I mean, that might have been more of just battleship dispersion. We certainly got lucky in this one that the dispersion from these enemy battleships was so bad as well. But the armor here holding up, and a combination of that and the limitations of the aiming system in this game, kind of taking advantage of that, helped me to get over 5 million potential damage in this game. Not a win, and that certainly is the case when you have a lot of these really good games when it comes to potential damage, tanking, and dealing a lot of damage. Typically they end up in losses because they're games like this where your team has lost so badly that the enemy team just charges at you. And that gives you good opportunity to farm a lot of damage, but you're probably not going to win. And there's maybe some things I could have done differently to impact the game more, to make it a little closer towards a win, but yeah, I don't think so in this one. Here's a great example. We slow down and turn out, and most of the shells miss us. Some of them are going to clip us anyway and do some damage, but we're not going to take the bulk of the enemy shells. That's the idea here. Unfortunately, this was like the 5th or 6th game of me playing Clausewitz, trying to finish off this cruiser potential damage mission, and I had like 1 million potential damage or less to go to finish the mission, and of course that last game gives me 5 million. Everything else was like blowouts before that. I was hardly getting shot at. But a nice example, at least, to put up on YouTube to show the tankiness of Clausewitz. And I think there's a lot of ways you can build a Clausewitz. You can even run a lighthouse build and make it work just because this ship is so tanky. Again, that it is 50 millimeters. That's pretty nice. And even though it's a rather large cruiser, it's still much smaller than a battleship, for example. So you are going to notice that you're not going to take massive hits most of the time when you're angled. The only unfortunate side is the turret angles. They are worse than Hindenburg. It does force you to go more broadside. You still can get overmatched here. 30 millimeters is the upper belt, so it's at range where you're much tankier against battleships compared to a Hindenburg. And it's very nice to have, I gotta say. It's very, very nice to have. The guns are a slightly bigger caliber, but the damage doesn't really work out to much more DPM, if anything at all. So it really does come down to that extra tankiness that allows you to play more like an old Hindenburg would. Here's the build that I was running. I was running Eye in the Sky just to give me that spotter plane back a little sooner, since some of these super ship games are pretty far range, right, where people stay outside 20 kilometers. We only have 18.5 kilometers of range, and I want to run reload mod, so this allows me to run it and still have the range when I need it, or most of the time. Other than that, just general tankiness, getting 5 heals here, getting survivability expert, gets us over 60k HP, which feels pretty nice. Concealment 12.8 is not too bad as well. It's a little bit slow, but that's okay. We have a very tanky cruiser on our hands that just kind of can sit there and farm and deal damage and not take too much in return. It's a pretty interesting, it's a surprisingly interesting super ship, I would say. It looks very boring on paper, but for those of you that played old Hindenburg and kind of missed that playstyle, before all the 30 mil overmatch got into the game, Clausewitz is a good option for you if you're into that playstyle. Here are the upgrades that I was running. Again, reload mod, very, very nice to have. And that's going to do it for Clausewitz today. Just had to share that crazy amount of potential damage that I got in a cruiser of all things. It can happen with some RNG on our side as well. But hey, good positioning and taking advantage of the game's limitations can give you some very good results as a cruiser. So thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day.